Hi ladies and gentlemen, I hope everyone is doing well today. Welcome to the first video of the school year covering experimental design. Remember to check your flipped classroom instructions for some tips on how I grade the chemquest. Remember that I grade out of 4 points. It's easy to get all 4 points, especially if you have your guidelines sitting right next to you. So to start, we're going to start looking at some questions. Remember, there's no such thing as a bad question, but there is such thing as an unscientific one. So for a question to be scientific, it must follow two purposes. First, it must be able to be tested by an experiment, or it must be able to be measured. Next, it must lead to other good scientific questions when it's answered. So because of this, we are able to ask ourselves when we're analyzing questions, we're able to ask ourselves, can this question be tested, and will it lead to other good scientific questions? If your answer is yes to both of these, then it's scientific. If your answer is no to either of these questions, then it is unscientific. So down here, we can start looking at question 1. So question 1, we're considering two groups of questions, and we need to determine which of them is scientific. So I know I've already accidentally circled the better one for this, but we're going to talk about it either way. So for 1A, we look at the question, why is there air? So now we ask ourselves these questions. Can this be tested? We say, why is there air can be tested? No. How are you going to test that? So we know that this is unscientific. So next, we come over here to what is air made of? We can ask ourselves, can this be tested? Yeah, we're able to figure out what air is made of nowadays. We already know that oxygen is in there because we breathe it. Then we can also ask ourselves, will it lead to any other good scientific questions? Yeah, it probably would, because then you can start asking yourself, what is oxygen used for? What else is in the air that it interacts with? Do they make any compounds? And you can just keep going on and on from there. So now do the same thing for B and C. Use these two questions to help you determine which one is scientific and unscientific. For question 2 is a carry on from question 1. We need to look at the unscientific questions and say what about them made them unscientific. So remember from A, why is there air? That is the unscientific question. Remember, this is unscientific because we can't test it. There's no experiment, no test that we can run to say why is there air. So we know that it's bad because it cannot be tested. So then do the same thing for B and C. Whichever ones you found is unscientific, just give a short explanation on why it was. Now we're moving on to a few definitions. These are probably some definitions that you've already seen before. So we're starting with dependent variable, independent variable, control, and then I add down here placebo. So your dependent variable is a resultant in the experiment. It's always the outcome. It's always what the researchers want to find out what happens. So because of that, it responds to what's changed. It's what's measured. That's how I determine what the dependent variable is. Next, we can look at the independent variable. The independent variable is the causing factor. It's the factor that shapes or determines the outcome. It's the variable that we are purposely adjusting, the variable that we purposely manipulate. Another word is change. It's the variable that we change so we see what happens to the dependent variable. We see what happens to the outcome. Next, we have the control. The control is what we keep constant. We keep everything constant except one variable, the independent variable. That way, when we change the independent variable, we see how it affects the outcome. And then lastly, we have the placebo. Our placebo is the substance that has no effect. It's used as a control in every study to see what happens when nothing's given to the patients. So now moving on to the second page. So from here on out, we're going to start looking at some studies, and we're going to have to analyze them to determine what the independent and the dependent variable are. So I wrote some questions to think about when you're reading the passages to determine what our variables are. So to determine the independent variable, I ask myself, what variable am I changing? What is adjusting? For the dependent variable, I say, what variable am I measuring? What's the outcome? What am I looking at? So we have a great example right here to start. So with this example, you can read it, But I also made some pictures to help people who are a little bit more visual learners and don't really want to read. So right here, we have two rooms in this study. In the first room, we have a room with 5 plants. Uh, in that room, we're going to be measuring the growth of the plants for a month. For a few hours each day, these plants are going to be listening to classical music. So that's what you see here. We got our fancy composers with their wigs and the pianos and the violins and the nice, soft, relaxing music. Then in the other room, we have our 5 plants. We're going to be testing the growth rate for a month. But this time, instead of listening to classical music, we're going to be listening to rock music with the bass guitars and just the regular guitars and the amplifiers and loud music. So in this study, we need to determine what our dependent variable and the independent variable is. So we can ask ourselves, to determine the independent variable, what variable are we adjusting? When we look at these pictures, what is the only difference between the rooms? It even tells us here. I mean, it does tell us. So when we're looking at the independent variable is the music. It's the only thing we're changing when we go from room to room. We're going from classical music to rock music. So next, when we're asking ourselves about the dependent variable, we're figuring out what we're measuring. So what's the overall outcome that we're looking at? And that is the height of the plants. That's the overall outcome. Which kind of music is affecting the plant height the most? Then for controls, you just have to think about other things you need to hold constant, things like water and sunlight, even stuff like type of soil, the size of the pot they're in, how long they listen to the music each day. All of that stuff would have to be held constant so you can truly see only the difference between the music. So this next scenario, we're gonna talk through it. I'll help you answer some of the questions, and then the last few scenarios you're gonna work on yourself. So again, guys, I made a picture to help some people out. So this is a breast cancer treatment. In this study, there are 15 women. We have our emojis here to help us out, help us describe this time. So there's 3 groups of 5 women. So in the first group, we have 5 women that are taking 20 milligrams of a breast cancer treatment. In a group number 2, there is 5 women taking 40 milligrams. Group number 3, there are 5 women taking a placebo that have no active ingredients whatsoever. So the overall test of the overall thing that they're doing is, so then they're taking these pills. I just have to look up the number of weeks for 20 weeks. And then at the end of the 20 weeks, they are going to measure the size of the tumors to see if the if the medicine had any effect, and if the dosage mattered. So what we need to determine is the independent variable in the investigation. So again, I wrote our question down here to help us. What variable are we changing? What's the only difference when we go from group to group? If you look, it's pretty obvious. It's right on top. You see it's the amount of medication, or if they're taking medication. So then next we come to the dependent variable. So again, I wrote our question to help us when we're thinking. So when we're thinking about the dependent variable, what's the variable that we're measuring? What's the overall thing that we're looking at the end? And remember, I said we're looking at the size of the tumors. We're going to determine if the size of the tumors got smaller or larger. So did the pill help or hurt? Next we're coming on question 5. So question 5 says, in this kind of study, the researchers know which group is which. They know which group is getting the 20 milligram pill, the 40 milligram pill, and the placebo. How do you think this affects the results of the experiment? How does it affect the bias of the researchers? So imagine this scenario. Imagine that you're the researcher. You've been doing this research for months, probably even years, on this drug, on this compound that you hope cures breast cancer or helps breast cancer. You've sunk so much time, money, effort into this, blood, sweat, and tears, and now this little tiny pill, this study, this is the culmination. This is the peak of all of your work to see whether it works or not. If you know you want it to work, and you know which group you want the outcome you want to work and have good results, how would that affect you while you're doing the research, while you're making observations, while you're conducting the research, while you're helping out the groups? Just think about it. Would it make you biased in any way? So pause it and think about number 5. Right now I'm going to move on to number 6. So number six is a little bit more straightforward. Number 6 tells you that people in studies just start to drop out as it goes on. So in the case of this breast cancer study, what could they do to minimize the effects on the study of people not completing it? This one's a little bit more straightforward. I don't need to explain it as much, so just try to come up with a few reasons. Number 7. Number 7 and number 8 go together. So this is just doing a little bit of word similarities. So we're comparing independent variable to manipulated variable and dependent variable to responding variable. So to answer these questions, think about the term, think about what manipulated means and how it can represent independent variable. Think about responding variable and what the word responding means and how that could represent a dependent variable. The definitions that are on the front will be helpful when you're thinking about these questions. So next we have another section, another study, caffeine and taking tests. So this is one of the last studies on here. This one I'm not going to help you guys with, so I want you to read through it, analyze the chart, and then answer questions 9, 10, and 11. 2 of the questions are just identifying the variables. Then lastly on question 12. Question 12 says you have 2 brands of fertilizer, brand X and brand Y. You want to determine which one of these fertilizers will help plants grow better. So in this question, it doesn't tell you anything about the study. Instead, you need to think about it and try to come up with your own. So in the first part, you need to think about which variables do you want to control, what do you want to keep constant. Then you need to think about what you want to test, what's going to be the overall outcome of your goal. We already know what that is from just reading the problem. Next, what is the independent variable? What are you going to try to change to determine our outcome? And then lastly, I just want you guys to provide a little bit of an outline for your experiment, a little bit of description. If you had to conduct this experiment, how would you run it? I do want you to write this on a separate piece of paper, especially part D, because I would like to collect this. So at the end of this year, I'm going to try to end every video with a joke. This was inspired by a few students I had last year. So this is a classic. It's one of the jokes. It's a joke I'm going to start with. You can thank Jess Mannion for this one. So what do you call a fish with no eyes? So guys, if anyone has a joke that you would like to have at the end of the video, please send it to me and I will give you a shout out. I hope everyone has a great day.